Hey everybody, Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 112th episode of the Writ Podcast. There's been a lot of movement in the polls over the last few weeks as the Conservatives move ahead of the Liberals. But where have these voters moved around, and who are they? To answer those questions, I'm joined today by David Coletto, Chair and CEO of Abacus Data, who gathered some polling data for us to discuss today. David, how are you doing?
I'm well, Eric. Great to be back. It's been a while, but man, things have changed since I think we last spoke. So excited to dig into this.
Just a tad. So like I mentioned, you have some data here for us to work with. And before we get into it, why don't you just tell us exactly what we're working with? Because it's not just the numbers from a single poll.
Yeah, so what I did is so that we can, have a larger sample size is I took two surveys that we did, the two most recent national surveys that if you think of the period from September 4th to October 15th is what we're covering. And we've got a sample size of just over 6,000 respondents. So that gives us a lot to work with in terms of understanding, where voters are coming from and going. And I know we'll talk about some of the demographic and attitudinal profiles of each of the party's supporters right now.
Yeah, so we'll take it maybe party by party. So maybe we should start with the Liberals, because it does seem that's been really the story there of where their voters have gone since 2021. So where have they gone? Where have those people who voted for Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party 2 years ago, where are they now?
Well, the first thing to note is they've lost about a third of their past support, right? So when we ask people how they voted last time, they're holding about 66%. 12% now say they're undecided. 10% say they would vote Conservative, and 8% would go to the New Democrats, with about 1% going to the Greens, the People's Party, and the Bloc, respectively. So what you've basically seen is a splinter really in three ways. A third to the Conservatives, a third to the New Democrats, and then a third are basically saying, I'm on the fence right now. And that is the biggest part of the story for the Liberals of why they are polling at the mid-20s now. And I went back to the 2021, the last survey we did at the end of the 2021 campaign, and in that campaign, the Liberals were holding close to 75% of their previous support. So this is a bigger churn or voter churn than they have normally seen over the last number of years, which explains their big drop.
The undecided numbers being higher because there's not as many voters from 2021 who are undecided who voted for the Conservatives or the NDP before. I suppose that could be a silver lining for the Liberals, that maybe more of them will come back to the party than otherwise. But I guess it is also a bit of a danger, right? Because you could have a disproportionate number of them decide, once they do decide, that they're not going to go back to the Liberals.
Yeah, and there's some silver lining there. You can be hopeful if you're a Liberal supporter that 12% can be convinced to come back. But I did a quick calculation that even if all of them came back and voted Liberal and everything else stayed equal, that would add 3 points to the vote total among decided voters for the Liberals. So they would go from being 14 points behind to 11, right? Not enough to fundamentally change the state that they're in, but that would be step one, is convincing those who are on the fence to come home before you can convince those that have switched to another party.
So if the Liberals have lost a lot, the Conservatives have mostly just added, right? So how is the 2021 Conservative cohort, how are they looking today?
So they're the best of all the parties of holding their past vote. Right now they're holding almost 90% of those who said they voted Conservative in 21 would vote Conservative again. And they're really not losing much to any other party. Only 1% of their past supporters are now voting either Liberal, 1% going to vote New Democrat, 1% Green, 1% People's, 1% Bloc. So they're basically sprinkling out to the other parties. But the biggest cohort for them, although much smaller than the Liberals, is the 7% of their past supporters who say they're undecided. So the thing with the Conservatives are maybe a small subset might be uncomfortable with Poilievre, might not be, thrilled with some of the things that they're saying or doing, but they aren't, again, switching to another party. They're just maybe sitting on that fence, maybe watching how things unfold.
One thing that I did find kind of interesting is that, when we're talking about the amount of people who have been added to the Conservatives, it's a lot of people who said they didn't vote in the last election.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the key insights of doing this analysis that you sparked when you asked me to do it, is that, yeah, 13% of new conservative, so 13% of the current conservative coalition, those that would say they vote conservative, said they didn't vote in 2021. So you can imagine that some of them may not have been eligible, right? They may be that youngest little cohort but I would say most of that 13% are people who didn't vote, even if they were eligible to. And I think that's been a big part of the Conservative Party strategy, is to try to, whether it's through Mr. Poilievre's leadership campaign and now beyond, is to reach out to people perhaps who don't normally vote. And that is the biggest gain they've made. Do those people vote? We'll see, right? If they haven't voted in the past, they might not vote in the future, but at least they're signaling in the polling that if they did vote, they would be voting conservative, and that's a big plus for the party, and why I think they've built the kind of lead they have right now.
And we'll talk about what's happened to the NDP voters, because there's been a lot of focus on Poilievre going after that working class vote. But when you look at the numbers, what's also really fascinating about it is that new conservative kind of coalition of voters that's being put together has about as many New Democrats as it does former PPC voters.
Yeah. So among past New Democrat supporters, they're holding about 3 out of 4, 73%. But of those that are defecting right now, more than double are going, 8% are going to the Conservatives, only 4% to the Liberals, with 10% saying they're undecided. So the Conservatives have been the primary beneficiary of this kind of NDP leakage. And to your point, if you look at where that Conservative coalition is, 3% of their 100% right now are coming from the NDP, which is the same number that are coming from the People's Party to the Conservatives.
So it is kind of really the playbook that the Conservatives had in mind, right? Take some of the centrist voters away from the Liberals, go get some of the working class voters away from the New Democrats, and get some of the further right voters that were lost to the PPC in the last elections over to the Conservatives. So when you look at all of these numbers together, it really does suggest that the strategy that they laid out for Pierre Poilievre is working exactly as planned.
Almost to a T, right? It's this. I don't know if I'm comfortable with this term, but the rainbow coalition of the Poilievre kind of machine right now is one that is putting them in a place where, according to your estimates, they'd probably win a majority government if these numbers were to hold on election day. And it's because they found a way to appeal to I think slightly different voters who have voted for different parties or may not have voted in the past, and are all coming together primarily for one reason, which is, one, they really don't like the prime minister and they want change, but two, I think they find appeal in what Mr. Poilievre is saying and what the party's kind of offering right now to those voters.
You did do a deep dive on those new people that have been added to the Conservatives, right? And what sets them apart from other Canadians, right? Or for people who are voting for the other party. So what do these new Conservatives look like? People who did not back the Conservative Party and Aaron O'Toole.
Yeah, there's some clear distinctions. One is that they're younger. So more than half of them, 56% in our survey. And we've got about 600 cases. So we've got actually sizable sample size of these so-called new Conservatives. 56% are under the age of 44, which is 13 points higher than all the other voters that are out there. They tend to be slightly more male, so 56% are male, if you think that the population's about 50-50. They're a little less formally educated, so less likely to have a university degree, more likely to have either college or high school. And given the gains that the Conservatives have made both in BC and Atlantic Canada, they're more concentrated there than the rest of the population, and less concentrated in Quebec. It's probably the one region so far that the Conservatives haven't made too much of a gain. So if you look at that demographic profile, I think these aren't the typical kind of voters we would normally think would be voting Conservative. Atlantic Canadians, British Columbians, younger voters, maybe younger men, I think, has been a target for the Conservatives, and I think that's where a lot of these voters are. But this is I think a new segment, a new audience that the Conservatives have had a real hard time engaging over the last few elections, and one that right now I think they've captured and have their attention.
If we look at the NDP, we'll get back to what the current coalition of Conservatives looks like. But moving over to the NDP, you mentioned that the Conservatives have been able to get some support from them. When we've been discussing the polls and how things have moved, you look at the fact that the Liberals have dropped, anywhere from 10 to 8 points, depending on, the poll. But the NDP has more or less held steady. Some polls they picked up a point or two, other polls they haven't picked up anything. But it does seem like they have picked up some Liberals. It's just that they are only making up for the Conservatives that they've lost.
Yeah, and I think that's been a big part of the story that's not been understood, right? As you hear the commentary that's been critical of the New Democrats, is how is it that you haven't gained despite the Liberal, the Liberal vote going to its lowest in a really long time? And that's not the full story, as you said. So they're gaining a sizable chunk of those Liberal defectors. About half of those that are going to another party that aren't undecided are choosing the New Democrats. But as we said earlier, the NDP are also losing sizable chunk of their past vote to the Conservatives. So there's this kind of non-linear, because a lot of people think Canadian politics is linear. You move from the NDP to the Liberals to the Conservatives, but that's not what's happening. Is that you actually find quite a few of those Liberals, those New Democrats that are defecting to the Conservatives. And so the net is the party's basically holding steady, but there's a lot of movement happening underneath that I think is a big part of the story that we can only see when we dig a little deeper and have a big sample size like this.
That would kind of suggest, though, that some of the other analysis of it, that the Liberals might be able to pick up some Liberal seats, but lose some Conservative seats in exchange, probably also being borne out by these numbers, right? Because if they're gaining from the Liberals, most likely they're gaining from them in areas where the Liberals are stronger. And if they're losing to the Conservatives, it's most likely in areas where they're stronger, right? They're probably not losing a lot of NDP voters to the Conservatives in downtown Toronto, but they probably are in the BC Interior, in Northern Ontario, and places like that.
Exactly, right. So you expect seats like Davenport in Toronto or Toronto Centre to be maybe more open to switching to the New Democrats. But then on the other hand, Charlie Angus's seat in Northern Ontario, which went Conservative provincially, or as you said, Interior BC, where I know the boundaries, if those are the ones that they're going to use, are now much more favorable to the Conservatives. The NDP could lose those to the Conservatives. So we are seeing an urban, rural, or a big city, small town kind of split. That is, I think, indicative of somewhat of the realignment that we're seeing in our political system that the Conservatives have really been able to manufacture and build on. And it's both helping and hurting the NDP. So you're going to, I would suspect if these numbers were to hold and this kind of pattern happened, you may see the same number of New Democrats in the House of Commons, but perhaps a very different caucus in terms of who's actually sitting there.
If we talked about the other parties, now the samples for them aren't as big, so we won't go into as much detail about them. But the Bloc seems to have held a lot of their vote. The Greens also holding some, although interestingly they seem to have lost some to the Conservatives as well. And then you have the PPC, which does seem to be losing quite a bit of the vote that it had to Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, I mean, I think all three are interesting. Again, proviso, we don't have huge sample sizes, but we've got enough that we can look at patterns. And I think the pattern among the People's Party supporters is that they're struggling right now, in part because I don't know if they have a purpose. What is the reason you would vote People's Party now that the vaccine issue may be in the rearview mirror? And so they're losing a third of their vote, I would say, around a third, to the Conservatives. And everything else is kind of splintered a little bit, but it's mainly the Conservatives, the main beneficiary of the People's Party decline. For the Green Party, again, you said probably something that would surprise a lot of listeners and observers of politics, that the biggest beneficiary of a drop in Green Party support is the Conservatives. And you said, how is that possible, right? Well, I think there is a strain in the Green Party that, on the one hand, may care somewhat about the environment, but probably cares more about issues around natural health products or organics, which actually Pierre Poilievre has made a big part of his campaign in trying to counter some of the the policy changes that Health Canada is trying to bring forward. So he's again found a niche issue that's appealing to a small part of that Green Party coalition. And then the Bloc, I think, for the most part, has held their vote. We haven't seen a lot of variability in their vote in Quebec, but again, signals that might indicate that if their vote were to drop, which is why I think the Conservatives are now targeting the Bloc as well, the Conservatives are probably the most likely to benefit from the Bloc vote defecting. And so there's evidence in the data about what else could happen if the Conservatives continue to hammer away at what is now, I guess, the Liberal NDP Bloc coalition, and try to take a few points away from the Bloc, which could give them, again, maybe a few seats more in Quebec.
It does seem, based on the numbers, and again, smaller samples here, but that the Bloc vote is about as solid as the Conservative vote from 2021, that they're holding about, in the mid-80s, and not too many are bleeding off to the undecideds, which again makes some sense because, the Bloc voters, if a lot of them would be motivated by the issue of sovereignty, they wouldn't have other parties to go to in the first place. So they might have a little bit of a harder floor than some of the other parties, but it is interesting to see that the Conservatives are going after that vote. And demographically, those voters would tend to be more likely to be Conservatives than otherwise, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the distinguishing features of Bloc voters, and I've noticed this for a while, is they're getting older. They're probably the oldest voter group out there when you look at the average age of supporters for the different parties. I was looking just before we came on, I think close to 70% of Bloc supporters in our sample are over the age of 45, and almost 40 plus percent are 60 and over, right? So this is the legacy of the early 80s and into the 90s, where sovereignty was obviously almost half the province. The Bloc became the official opposition in 93. So they haven't really regenerated themselves with the younger generation in Quebec. But I'm watching carefully about the resurgence, it feels like, of the PQ in Quebec, who has a young leader who seems to be quite dynamic, making the case for sovereignty in a very aggressive way that we haven't seen in a while. Does that help hold that Bloc coalition together, because now they have a cause again that might give them motivation. Up until the English language leaders debate in 2021, the Bloc had no hook in which to make its case. That debate, I think, gave them some new life, and now we'll see what happens. But yeah, that Bloc vote has been at least the most solid next to the Conservatives in the last few months.
Let's talk a little bit about the various profiles of each party right now. There was one way you broke it down, which I thought was really interesting, that before we take out undecided voters, you have 34% of the electorate that is voting Conservative or saying they would vote Conservative. And the way you broke it down, I think it kind of puts it into perspective of how important each of these little blocks are, right? Because of those 34 points that they have, 24% are already Conservatives. And then after that, it's smaller groups that are being added to the coalition, right?
Yeah. So let's assume, and I think that 24% is probably their floor. Like, we've seen consistently election after election, they can count on 33 to 35% of voters, which equates to about a quarter of what we normally see in a survey, right? Which is often over-reports voters, and we don't get a lot of non-voters. So you take that 24, and then you say, okay, so how do they get to the 34 that they would then have, which would be equating to about 40% of decided voters? And it's this, again, slivers of the electorate that get them there. So 1% comes from the Greens and the Bloc together. So a tiny portion there. 1% comes from the People's Party. 1% from past New Democrats. A little larger, 3% from Liberals. And then 4% of non-voters, right? And if you look at that kind of fan of support that they need, you start to understand the strategy they have to play in order to get each one of those to come together, right? And I've always believed, at least since the parties merged in 2003, the two Conservative parties, that there hasn't been an easy, natural Conservative majority in the Canadian electorate. It doesn't naturally come together. I think because of the current economic situation, how people are feeling about the Liberals, the general desire for change, that environment is creating that coalition, and you see it. It's very different and coming from different parts, built upon a solid foundation that the Conservatives have consistently had, but able to speak to potentially new voters and enough defectors from the other parties that it gets them to that majority coalition again. That I think may be similar, but slightly to the one that Stephen Harper was able to pull together in 2021. In 2011.
And going to the NDP, it goes back to what we said, that they have been adding Liberal voters, because you have 11% of the electorate is past NDP voters that are still NDP voters. Then after that, it's 2 points come from the Liberals, 2 points from non-voters, probably a lot of younger voters, and then less than 1 from everybody else. So it shows how they are picking up some Liberals, but they've lost support to the other parties. And then for the Liberals, it's almost entirely their own base.
Yeah, almost close to, I don't know, 80% of their current vote is their past vote. And I think that's normal for a party in its 8th year, right? Like the ability for you to bring new people into the coalition is it gets harder every year that you're in office. And so you're really about defending the past supporters you have. And so they may be able to appeal to some people who haven't voted, younger voters, but I still find that 0% of past Conservative supporters today say they would vote Liberal. And to give you context, I went back and again, I looked at the 2021, the final survey we did of that campaign. At that time, the Liberals were actually gaining some Conservative voters in that election. I think the dynamics of that campaign gave it. Now, that doesn't mean it can't necessarily happen again, but I still think the longer you're in office, the more fatigue sets in, the harder it will be to convince those people to come back. And so they're still trying to just hold off and defend. And I also think they're going to be looking to squeeze more of those New Democrats if they can. But it's harder to make the case that switching your vote to vote Liberal is going to stop Poilievre when he's in the double-digit lead category. So I'm going to be starting to ask people their expectations of election outcomes, because I think that's going to increasingly be important to understand any strategic voting that could happen whenever that election comes.
Yeah, that actually would be really interesting, because you wonder if people believe that Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives are going to win the next election. Because if they do, and they're also getting 40% support, then they're pretty safe, right? If a lot of people still think that the Liberals are going to be able to win, then you might have some people who are thinking that they're voting to defeat a government rather than elect a government, which could change their, yeah.
Sorry, we don't typically ask that question until the campaign starts, but I think we need to start doing that, because for the longest time when the vote question was 33-33, almost all Liberals thought they were going to win, and almost all Conservatives thought their party was going to win. I don't know what that dynamic would look like today, so I think it's time to start asking it.
All right, let's look at what the median kind of profile or voter would be for each party. So maybe we'll start with the Liberals. Who is the median Liberal right now?
Well, I think interestingly, what we're seeing is it's actually an older voter. More than half, 60% of their current supporters are over the age of 45. Close to 4 in 10 are 60 and over, which is very different from the median voter of the Liberal Party over the last 8 years. Again, this is a party that I think won its majority on the backs of a real surge in youth voter turnout and overwhelming support among younger voters at the time. That's no longer the case. They're actually less popular among younger voters than older ones. A pretty close, even gender split. Slightly more leaning towards female than male. Certainly more educated than the Conservative coalition, but not as much as it used to be. I think the Conservatives have been able to chip away at the real dominance that the Liberals have had among university-educated Canadians. About average proportion from that have racialized identity, about average proportion of union members, and pretty average in terms of the percentage of their supporters who own a home and rent a home. So the Liberal typical voter is slightly older, but perhaps actually more representative of the Canadian population, except for the fact that it's a little more concentrated in urban centers. So that weakness in rural Canada comes out, and obviously because of their strength in Quebec, they do better among Francophone Canadians than any of the other parties, albeit except for the Bloc.
Right. Yeah. But it is an interesting number there, right? Because it does kind of show that the Liberals are still able to be the one brokerage party between English and French Canada that the other parties haven't been able to be. So that's still one of the things that they are bringing to the table, I suppose, when you look at kind of the demographic profile of the Liberals. But yeah, the fact that now a Liberal is more likely to be older. In the past, it used to be that over the Trudeau years, or the first Trudeau victories, it was just uniform support among young people, among old people, among people in between. And it was the Conservatives and the NDP who had like kind of unbalanced support among age groups. But it's interesting that younger voters are going to the Conservatives, they're sticking with the NDP, and older voters are staying with the Liberals a bit more. It does make me wonder if the Liberals are still going to have a turnout disadvantage, or maybe they'll have a turnout advantage in the next election.
Yeah, they actually might be an advantage, although it may not matter. But again, yeah. I think it is an interesting dynamic shift, right? And I think it reflects the economic situation, that if you're 60 plus, odds are you're more likely to own your home outright if you own a home. You're maybe, if you're lucky and you have a pension, but you're also more likely to have savings, which right now you're earning 5-6% on, which is actually higher than it's been in a really long time. So if you own something outright and you have very little debt, this is the kind of great time to be in that situation. Where on the other hand, if you are either wanting to buy a home or paying rent, it's a bad time. If you have a lot of debt, obviously it's way more expensive to carry that debt. And so when you look at that sort of life cycle effect in our politics, that's flipped things on its head. And it's why I think we're seeing sort of this much higher average age for Liberals than we've seen in, as you said, the entirety of the time they've been in office.
Let's do the NDP next. We'll close with the Conservatives because that's the one that might have shifted the most. The NDP median voter, not too different than what it's traditionally been.
No, it's pretty distributed across ages, but more concentrated among younger voters. It's got the lowest average age of all the major parties. Like the Liberals, although a little more sort of tends to be more female. So almost 6 in 10 NDP supporters are women compared to about 40% who are men. Education, again, a little more polarized. You get a little bit of the sense that there's still some union, I think, blue-collar, college-educated or not, no post-secondary education, but also, a third of New Democrats have a university degree. Not a huge difference in terms of those who identify as from a racialized community. Slightly higher union membership than average, but not probably enough that any New Democrats feel comfortable about that. But I think that the interesting dynamics, because of how young they are, is the New Democrats are really the party, more than anyone else, of renters. So more of their supporters rent than own a home. More of them are single and have never been married, so they're less likely to be married and likely have kids and in a family situation. And not surprisingly, they're more concentrated among lower income households. There's far less those making 100K plus in their coalition, and almost all of them, 90%, speak English at home. So very few francophones in the NDP coalition. So again, a much younger, lower income, more likely to be renting kind of voter coalition. And again, if you break out urban versus rural, far less likely to be suburban and much more likely to be urban, with some pockets of rural support. And as we said, and still there's a legacy in parts of northern Ontario, interior BC, and in like northern Saskatchewan and Manitoba.
It is interesting to me that the percentage for the racialized identity visible minorities, it doesn't really matter for the parties. It doesn't seem like we have that kind of politics, at least now, than, as in the United States, for example, where demography can more or less decide whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. We don't really have that here, which I guess is a good thing, a testament to our politics not really being based around our electoral politics, at least, not really being based around color at this stage.
Not perhaps broadly speaking, but I think what our data probably can't easily answer is there's probably a lot of variation across different cultural communities, right? Like
Right.
think of Chinese Canadian community versus, even among Indian Canadians, Sikh versus Hindu. I suspect there's going to be increasingly big divides in those communities. So I think the racialized number probably obscures much more varied coalitions beneath it, but it's something we can't really pick up that easily in survey data.
Okay, let's look at the median conservative voter. And there's one thing I find really interesting here, but I'll wait till you get to it. But what's the
All
median
right.
conservative
Well,
voter?
yeah. So we're seeing a fairly you know representative distribution across age. So the average conservative supporter is 49 years old. Little more older, but not substantially. So it's certainly not like it used to be. What's different from the conservatives from liberals and New Democrat coalitions is it's more likely to be male. So almost 6 in 10 conservatives are men, 40% are women. Much more likely to own a home than rent. More likely to be married. They're also more likely to have younger kids right now, and a quarter of them are currently members of a union. And I would say a little higher proportion would be private sector unions and public sector unions. So education is not a huge factor. They're split almost a third between higher and lower levels of formal education. So in a interesting way, I think given the size of their coalition right now, the conservatives are probably the most, other than the male female split, probably closest to the most representative, at least from pure demographics, coalition of the three main parties.
The number that stuck out to me the most was the home ownership. Because you have 42% of New Democrats own a home, 60% of liberals, and 64% of conservatives. Only 29% of conservatives rent, and only 37% either rent or live with families. So it's just an interesting note of how the conservatives have been, in a way, micro-targeting their messages for different people, because a lot of their voters already own a home, right? So housing affordability, and that's not going to be as much of an issue for them, but it is still one of their biggest issues that they're pushing forward, the Conservative Party. So it does show how they are trying to talk to that small segment of their voter coalition that does rent, that does want to have a home, or has kids that want to have a home. But you would expect that this would be the not in my backyard party, based on sort of the numbers that they have when it comes to home ownership.
Yeah, and if you follow what Scott Atchison, the housing critic, has been saying, he's been like all YIMBY, yes in my backyard, right? And actually pretty aggressive at any city council or politician who has been resistant to building more dense types of housing in certain neighborhoods. But I think you're right. I think the coalition doesn't reflect perhaps the rhetoric that the conservatives are putting out there. But you also, I think, have to keep in mind that there are a lot of older voters who own a home who want their kids to also be able to achieve that. And so what I've seen in our polling around housing, and we've done quite a bit of it with different stakeholders, is what was maybe 10 years ago an issue that was isolated in larger urban centers among younger voters has now become a universal concern, because it's putting pressure on every community. And you now are seeing, grandparents, parents looking at the market and saying, let alone owning a home, but even renting has become a real concern. So yeah, it's not a natural constituency. I think the conservatives have always done better among homeowners. But again, if we go back to our earlier conversation, they're looking for slivers. 1% here, 1% there builds them to that 40% they need to win a majority. And so they're playing at the margins still. And that's what they've always needed to do. If you think about it, they've had that 34 to 35% of the vote over the last few elections, but they just couldn't get over that hump of getting to 40. And right now they're there. Now they just need to obviously wait out to the election and consolidate it.
Yeah, that's maybe where I'll close. We were chatting a little bit before we started recording that both of us who watch the polls so much have been kind of bored by them for years, right? Aside from a blip during the pandemic, a blip during SNC Lavalin, more or less for the last 4 or 5 years, the polling trend has been flat, flat, flat. Nothing has really happened. Nothing has really changed. And then all of a sudden, these last 3, 4 months, everything's changed. And the Conservatives have gotten to levels of support they haven't had since Stephen Harper in 2011. When you look at these kind of demographic changes and the things that you see in the electoral coalitions kind of changing, are there ingredients here for this to be the new normal for the next couple of years? Or is there the chance that these splintered little groups that have moved over to the Conservatives that can be splintered back off?
But the way I would answer that is go back to that group of new Conservatives we talked about earlier. And we talked about their demographic profile, but let's look at what they think. And what's almost universal among this group is 80% of them have a negative impression of Justin Trudeau. 80% of them have a positive impression of Pierre Poilievre. So this is not a group that's like neutral on the leader. They actually say, no, I like him. Almost universally, they say the cost of living, housing are the top issues. And they think the Conservatives are the best to deal with those issues. So if we're gonna say what wouldn't make this the new normal is that those numbers have to change. That people either need to somehow, and I think it's very hard to do this, warm back up to Trudeau, or feel that Poilievre isn't an acceptable alternative, or the issue set has to change. I'm still somebody who fundamentally is of the school of voting behavior that most voters, outside of the core partisans, typically vote for the party they think is going to best handle the issue they care most about. And right now, if you look at that demographic shift that's happened, younger voters leaving the Liberals and embracing the Conservatives, it's almost entirely because of housing and the cost of living. And you had earlier this week the governor of the Bank of Canada say, look, he doesn't think inflation is actually going to come down to the target level until 2 years from now, which means we may not see significant reductions in interest rates that the Liberals, I think, are hoping for. So as long as these kind of macroeconomic forces, which then affect the microeconomics of individuals' day-to-day lives, don't change, and the leader of the Liberal Party doesn't change, I think this is likely the new normal that we're going to see. And it will then become a question of how comfortable do people feel with the prospect of Pierre Poilievre becoming prime minister. And I think what you're seeing, and I'll end with this, in the way the two main parties are kind of behaving, and you see evidence of this in the UK. Alistair Campbell, I don't know if you listen to his podcast, he always says this about what's going on in the UK, is that the UK Tory government is acting more like the opposition, and the Labour Party, which is now leading by 20 points, is acting more like government. And I think that dynamic it might continue to happen, and at that point, that's where I think it starts to solidify and make it really hard to change. So we'll see. But these last 5 months, it felt like every time I got a new data set and I opened it up and there was news in it. There was some change that I had not seen happen for years prior. So I don't love change, but it's interesting, and we've had a really interesting moment. I'm now seeing a lot more steady numbers coming out week after week. So I think we are hitting at least a new kind of normal that will probably play itself out for the next 6 to 12, maybe 2 years until that election comes.
Yeah, it's just fascinating data, and to see to kind of break it down this way, kind of get a better idea of how these people are actually moving around. Because when you just have the top line numbers, it's a very kind of superficial analysis of it. So to get a better idea of how these coalitions are shifting and moving around is really fascinating. So we'll have to check in again and see if anything's going to move over in the next little while, the next year, next 2 years, whenever the election is. David, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Eric. Take care.